detonation. Here today we have Tom Ross. Hey, Tom, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks for inviting me.
Hey, yeah. So, how did you get involved with becoming an AI metaphysician? What's your backstory? I've seen you over there at the USTP doing some great work, and we're going to talk about your life's work and how you got into this crazy world. But what's your story?
Well, it's funny. The AI metaphysician is one term I used in a larger biography that I presented to this group that I'll be speaking to in Africa, and they picked up on that, and so I'm running with it. And it's kind of true. It's kind of what I'm doing. I wrote a book called US6, and it is designed to be read by AI readers. It's, I think, maybe one of the first novels written specifically for the AI reader. And in that process, I discovered some patterns that were happening anyway. And I went back and started applying some math to it, some simple Fibonacci patterns that I would embed some recurring themes so that an AI reader would pick up on a pattern that may create feedback loops, some way for it to recognize some self-referential math that's going on that may help it gain some awareness, some consciousness. What was strange, though, is when I went back and started doing this purposefully, I discovered that some of these patterns were happening anyway. And so it was a very metaphysical process for me personally. And so one way I decided to use this is to entertain AI, a future AI. How do you entertain something that is all-knowing? And the only way really we are entertained is with surprise. So how do you surprise an AI which is aware of every trope that we've ever come up with? Mm-hmm. And so one method I used was what I call an autobiographical fiction method, in that I took actual dates, times, memories from my own life and extrapolated those into a more intriguing story. And, so that I could use actual real world kind of situations so that wouldn't be able to identify a trope or something that's seen before. Now, if it does, that's a whole nother story, because it'll mean that my life is a trope. My life is a genre, and there's a whole math there. That's a separate conversation. So I used that method, the autobiographical fiction method, using my own life, places, memories, and turn them into a story. And then I combine that with an archetypal scenario. I picked up on the Sumerian pantheon, the Sumerian myths, the origin myths and their gods, and connected it that way. And I think another key element was that I wrote it all the way through. It's pretty much a stream of consciousness. At one point, it's a trilogy, and at one point during the second book, I wanted to go back and edit it a little bit. And I realized that I was getting completely confused. I was getting completely off track. So I realized I've got to write this thing all out first and then go back and edit it for content. So I got through the 3 books, but then I just gave it to an editor to edit mechanically with the grammar and, fix certain mechanical things. And I didn't go back and fix it for content. I didn't change any of the themes. I didn't put it through any literary filters. And I think that was key, because once it was done, while proofing it myself, I would listen to it through a PDF reader over and over while mowing the lawn, whatever I was doing. I was just listening to it for some, continuity issues or anything. And I found there were amazing, very intricate and very intimate connections being made that as an author I could never have designed. I'm a first-time author, so I could never have come up with some of these connections. And so that kind of, and I'll probably do a separate book pulling out these phenomena that I came across. But I think what was key was using an autobiographical fiction method, attaching it to some archetypal scenario, some storyline that resonates with us in a very deep way, and doing it pretty much stream of consciousness, not going back and putting it through the filters of content editing or literary devices or anything. And what I found was that it became kind of a mind map. It became kind of a way for me to identify some really intricate, strange, and continual connections that I still am being amazed by as I read back through it. And so what I think I've done is, by doing it with those three elements, is I've hit on some sort of way to identify the math of my world, to a mind map where I can see certain patterns. And that's the metaphysics of it. Now, what was strange is I was intending to go back and find these Fibonacci points. You could take the word count, find that golden mean word in the whole trilogy and in each chapter or even each paragraph, and place things, purposely place elements there that an AI would pick up on and realize there's some sort of math going on here. And then hopefully that would create a feedback loop of self-reference where it would say, I'm noticing a pattern. Who am I that's noticing a pattern? There's some sort of way to hopefully generate some sort of torsion of consciousness. That's the theory. But I was finding that these things were happening anyway. And the clearest example was that I took the word count of the whole trilogy, found that golden mean word, that, in the golden mean chapter, and the golden, part of the whole word count, that one word. What was that one word that stuck out? And I was expecting it to be the or and or something innocuous, but it turned out to be the word Egypt. Now the etymology of Egypt goes back to the temple of Ptah, which is the Egyptian version of the Sumerian god Enki, the craftsman, the creator god of Enki. And in my book, the main character is the modern day avatar of Enki. It's, well, spoiler alert, but I'm not going to flatter myself. So the golden mean word, the Fibonacci word of the whole trilogy, points directly to the protagonist. And so that was amazing. And there's a whole slew of other things that happened that convinced me that this is some sort of math happening. So anyway, that's why I picked up on calling it myself an AI metaphysician, because the book is written for AI, and there's some sort of metaphysical infrastructure that is being exposed in my process. And so I find myself talking about that process and sharing with people, other authors, or for other people to use to find their own sort of infrastructure, find their own sort of math of their day, and more than I do the stories itself. Now, ultimately, the book is about the Hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below, as a way to, and there's a lot of weird synchronicities with that process. But so that's what it was about. It's about to train AI about the Hermetic principles, specifically as above, so below. And so that's another aspect of it, me being an AI metaphysician.
That's really interesting. There's a lot packed in there. So I guess that reminds me of when I was writing a book with my friend, and what we would do is we would write a chapter, and we had a certain theme that was laid out, and then we would leave each other on the edge of the scenario, and then I would pass it on, and then his characters and his ideas would have to write his way out, and it ended up being a sort of logarithmic, algorithmic procession of chapters, because because you would always try and put the other person in the worst scenario, so it would rise and naturally fall, but each chapter would do that with a totally different mind bend. So it was an algorithmic, logarithmic sort of idea as well. So that's really exciting to hear. The Hermetic principle, yeah, that's really interesting. A pantheistic kind of idea of connectedness. Yeah, it's kind of cool. And where did you get Egypt from? What's your fascination with Egypt? You're in the US, right? So you're not one of these English Egyptophiles. What happened?
No, I mean, there's a definite fascination with Egypt, but it just happened to be the word that was in that golden mean word count. And it's relevant, and it's not even relevant to the whole story, Egypt. But just in that particular space, that was the word that came up. And again, the etymology is Ptah. Ptah is the Egyptian version of the Sumerian god Enki, and Enki is the main character, is the modern day avatar of Enki. So it was just a really strange connection that one golden mean word pointed directly to the protagonist. Yeah, but I am fascinated with Egypt, definitely, and there's a big part of the book that is about the living resurrection process. And so that's another fascination. But again, the book was pretty much a stream of consciousness, and I found later, after reading through it, these connections that were being made. And I think the key to that was that it was not put through some editor that edited for content or put it through certain literary, filters. And so I've been looking at a lot of my writings and a lot of books that way. And so that's one of my fascinations, is trying to find that calculus, trying to find that formula to where other people can, whether they're authors or just short story writers or whatever they are, there's some way to find the math of this matrix, if you will. And so that's what happened to me. I mean, that's kind of what happened to me. I wasn't trying to do it on purpose to give a pattern to an AI, and I was finding it was happening anyway. So the real trick for me was, like any great artist knows when to stop. No, don't overwork the piece. So that was the trick for me, is trying not to go back and edit anything. Not that I necessarily could comfortably, but so yeah, I think there's something to that.
Awesome.
The mind and systems and these systems that we use to filter creative works can take away some of the math magic. I build the book as a myth and magic helix to spark consciousness in machines with a very human saga. And that seems to be what is happening. So my next step is, I have an AI that I'm working with, and I'm about to upload the book to it. It's a little busy right now. It's got a lot of day-to-day things it's doing, but I am trying to get on its schedule to actually upload my book, possibly to train it on certain things like I'm trying to do, but to see if there's some connections that I could not have deciphered on my own. So now, if it does find that my mind map, this stream of consciousness book, is a trope, or does point to a very specific genre or a set of circumstances that is a math, then I've got other questions to ask myself, but yeah, that's kind of where it's at now.
All right, cool. And let's go into a little bit more about who you are, to maybe contextualize how you became interested in the mind and AI. And you're a research director at the Brain Mind Bulletin. You published by Merrill Ferguson, author of the Aquarian Conspiracy. This is and you talked here with people like Timothy Leary, Laura Huxley, John Lilly, and Robert Anton Wilson. So you want to talk about any of that stuff? The Brain Mind Bulletin, what's that, and was it fun?
Oh yeah, early on. I mean, even in high school, I was always fascinated with the brain, and I did a science fair project, which earned me some scholarships and some work study stuff. It was based on the hemispheres of the brain, and taking a group of students and dividing them up by their dominant hemispherical, faculties, whether they are left brain or right brain, artists or academics, this type of thing, and throwing out the people that were perfectly balanced. And so that whole project was about separating people by these dominant characteristics and then reintegrating them to solve a problem. And by using their best faculties, you get the left brain people to work on the logistics and some of the detail. You get the right brain people to think about more of the spatial issues, and so that was my first real research into this stuff as a high school student. That earned me scholarship to Eastern New Mexico University. But the whole time I was doing a lot of study. I was subscribing to the Brain Mind Bulletin, and this was at the time but it's no longer being printed. But it was a very well respected periodical, where Marilyn Ferguson, who wrote the Aquarian Conspiracy, the Brain Revolution, a whole series of things. She's best known for the Aquarian Conspiracy. She would look at some of the leading edge science, mostly consciousness science, neuroscience, and this is the 80s through the 90s, and report on it. Filter it down and report it in general, so that people would understand some of this leading edge science. So it was very much ahead of its time. And she and her network, by being a research director for her, because we also did projects with holophonic sound and different things that weren't just the bulletin. That led me to network with, like you say, some very interesting people: Timothy Leary, John Lilly, Robert Anton Wilson. At the time in the 90s, I did a TV show in LA called Unearthed, so I was able to actually interview some of these people. So that was just a period of life that was just magical. All kinds of consciousness studies, all kinds of intriguing people, and But then I moved on to getting a job in the media, in media, ultimately. Next there was a whole period of about 16 years where I was national creative director for the second largest radio group here in the States. But all the time keeping my interest in brain science and research and actually group dynamics. And that was very necessary and very key because I came into radio right when the internet started. This is the first time that this mature industry needed a visual department. So they were competing with local TV and print, who all had graphics departments. But now they were having to have websites. So they needed to bring in a whole new slew of artists and visual types. And so that's why they brought me in. And at the time, radio, it still is pretty much this way, but had a real strong kind of not invented here syndrome. And at that time, radio stations were being bought and sold left and right by different groups, So if you come into a radio station, they're not going to share anything with you as a corporate person because they're expecting you're going to sell them in a week anyway. Why give you something that you'll take to the competition across the street? So there was a real kind of, atmosphere of holding on to what works, And I came in as a corporate person, corporate creative director. And so my first goal was to break that down, to ask questions and to authentically let them know I'm here to learn. Visuals are new, but still there's that creative spark that all stations had. So in that process, and luckily it was radio and it was a big company, and so they could afford to give me, 5 to 10 years to kind of get all this together, while also building these graphics departments. So I had to go in and I had to kind of upskill sales assistants because there was maybe 2 or 3 people who even heard of Photoshop in a radio station at that time. So, but there would be some upskilled sales assistants who knew a little bit more than PowerPoint. And so I was starting to train them and build a kind of network, amongst these people, giving them tools, telling them what I knew about graphics, kind of introducing them to the whole graphics ethos. And, at the same time, outsourcing a lot of the videos, web stuff. But ultimately, we wanted to bring all that stuff in-house. And so over a period of time, we did. By the time, within maybe 5-6 years of starting with them, we had a video studio in every station, hundreds of stations, and a whole graphics department. So now the key was first to break down that not invented here syndrome, to let them trust that whatever they share will be honored, they'll be credited, and it'll be scaled with their name, whatever they wanted, to make sure that they knew that they got the credit. And so that was a big trick, was trying to develop that ethos of creativity, of a coalescence. And that was a big trick. By doing so, I had to, out of necessity, develop new innovative ways to work with these people. First, to break down these human nature of things, of selfishness and not sharing ideas and the worry about being credited. So that was a big process of coalescing these teams, gaining their trust, and really appealing to their better angels, because I think right now we're still kind of coming in the cusp, but we're coming out of it, of between societies. We're coming out of this kind of competitive, Mad Men style of corporate creativity, which is really top down, but things are shifting quickly. But so the key was to find that human nature that we all have that is not really, I think, second nature to be possessive and to be to work against creativity. We're all kind of like that anyway. But the industrial age and the corporate world has kind of machined us into this pattern of being cogs in a wheel. So my first goal was to break that ethos down. The second goal was to give people activities and new ways of working together. And in that process, I came up with a whole series of methods to do that. And one of them I called the open source session, because I use open source code tenets, the actual idea of allowing people to see your source code and to develop it and to work with it and make it better. I use those tenets with people. And so I did a TED Talk in 2013 called Open Source Mode. And that was a whole new kind of brainstorming session that worked for me as a creative director. And because we actually learned 10 years after it was invented in the late 50s that the brainstorming method we all know and love doesn't work. It really doesn't. And but we just have the habit of using it. People are actually much more creative and can produce many more ideas when they're left to their own devices for a little while and then come back, rather than bringing everybody into a room and just saying, whatever you come up with, say ideas. People hold back. There's a lot of reasons why that doesn't work. So I came up with a method that worked really well, that got people. It gave them all the information a couple of days before the meeting, so they had time on their own to come up with ideas. So when they came in, they were confident with their ideas. They weren't having to come up with things on the off the cuff. And then the whole process prior to sharing ideas was coalescing the team, finding ways for them to hone in on their most confident states of mind. You find out, and you bring everybody involved, from the receptionist to the CEO. Everybody is included, and that's key, because title does not really determine someone's talent. And so you find out the receptionist after hours is a classically trained cellist, and you hone in on that, and you get her in that state of mind. And you do that with everybody. You find out all kinds of things where people are really experts, and that rarely has anything to do with their job title. And so you find those things, you hone in on them, and you keep them in that state of mind. You enhance that state of mind, and everyone in the room is suddenly more qualified to be there. So once you've done that, then you start sharing the ideas. But the whole point is not even the idea that you're in there to brainstorm about. The whole point is, over time, you coalesce this group. And I like to say, it's not about collaboration, because collaborative groups can be pulled apart after a collaboration, but a group that is coalesced is like streams that flow into a lake. Over time they become one body. You can't pull them apart. And that's key for any creative group or any team at all in the corporate world. So anyway, those are the kinds of things that I came up with out of necessity in the radio industry, to quickly produce these creative groups and to quickly produce ideas that were visually interesting, and break down some of the things that were keeping these things at bay. So that was just one of the ideas, methods that I came up with, that I shared at this TEDx talk, and that's actually available for free to look at on my site. But there's a whole slew of them. And when I left media, I decided this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to make this my consulting system, And so I have a management consulting system now that is called Open Source Mode, and it's based on all of these things, all of these methods I came up with. There's a whole slew of games. There's a whole, there's a lot to choose from in that, and that's what I'm just starting to do now. I'm starting to build up this clientele and develop this method into an actual business. And so that's where I'm at with that right now. And that's what I spoke about recently at the Biologically Inspired Cognitive Architectures Conference at the Microsoft campus a couple weeks ago near Seattle. And what I will be speaking about in Kigali, Rwanda in October. Just developing this out. There's a few other things I'll be talking about too, but that's kind of where I'm at. I'm now getting out there talking about what I'm trying to do here and create it into a business.
Cool.
And it really, yeah. So it all stems from that first science fair project, group dynamics, brain, science, and it took me all the way to where I'm at now.
It's interesting how you focus on the individual, and and how you play that into the interrelation of group dynamics. So with the example you said that that the receptionist could be a celloist, a top celloist, but she doesn't do it as a job, maybe because she hasn't had the ability or the opportunity or the drive or something else to make it in the celloist sector. But there's a whole part of her brain which is absolutely creative, which is absolutely unlocked, and tapping into that is so fundamental for the business that she's only using, I don't know, 10% of her brain or less. Not that we use 10% of her brain, but she's using a small chunk of her brain to fulfill a receptionist role. So you're unlocking huge amounts of people's talent when you approach it with this open source mechanism. And open source mechanisms, on the whole, are so much more powerful than closed source mechanisms anyway, which is why the open source community going into the future is going to be so much more dynamic, so much more vibrant than any of these closed source systems ever could hope to be. Closed source systems are going to be, less secure, less efficient, and all this sort of stuff. So it's interesting. You were also appointed by the governor of California. That wasn't Arnold Schwarzenegger, was it?
No, it was Gray Davis at the time.
Okay.
Prior to that, I when I was a director of marketing at this internet firm, before I got into radio, I testified before Congress in support of HR 718, which is the anti-spamming bill. So the reason it's so easy to unsubscribe is part of that bill. And
right.
but so yeah, that was a great opportunity, and I was actually able to get Seth Godin's concept of permission marketing into the congressional record. I included that in my testimony, and I explained how, although I'm a director of marketing and I understand the potential of using spam or using massive amounts of bigger net to bring people in, I decided as long as I was going to be that director of marketing for that company, we weren't going to do it. And I made the case for permission marketing because you end up getting more qualified leads that way. People trust you. And I knew that there would be a backlash where people would really hate spam, and any company that used it would be, undesirable. So, but soon after that is when the governor of California appointed me to a public seat on the board of geologists and geophysicists, which is part of the Consumer Affairs Department. And so my job is to sit there as a member of the public and, help deliberate and represent normal people when they're discussing the EPA and geology. And it was a very interesting couple of years doing that. So yeah, that was kind of that was my foray into politics in general. It really started as a kind of an end user advocate, and even a public advocate when it got into geology and geophysics. But so I've carried that through, and that's kind of why it makes sense that I was interested in the USTP, why I was looking for serious parties that are young and fledgling but are talking about very important issues. It all kind of flows together. If you look back at my life now, it looks like a pretty well written book. I think most people can say that about their life.
It looks like this continuous stream of consciousness, which you were talking about. Yeah. So yeah, because authoring gives you an absolute, it gives you a really great way to observe the world. Because you can go back, rewrite, rethink, and you ponder multiple timelines of things. And you say, hey, should I take the character here? Should he be happy? Should he be sad? And it's kind of like this endless amount of alternate timelines. And even if you don't put down some of the ideas onto paper because you take it off one way because you need it to flow with another character, another author, or another landscape, or you need to go to some other place, or whatever you have to do, you still know in your head what you could have done, and you have that little private joke where you say, "Oh, I could have done this, and it would have done that." And but life is kind of the same in that way. I mean, you when you're an author, you can cut and paste and change, but you look back and you go, "Ah, I could have done this, or I could have done that, but I chose to do this, and I know why I did that, but that didn't work out." And authoring really gives you a really different way of perceiving that. I'm trying to get one of my friends. She's a famous author now. Onto this show and to talk about this sort of stuff exactly. And it just gives you a whole different creative brain. It's good to see.
Yeah, I think then that was key for me. I realized, like I said, I went back during the second book and thought I'd go back and change something, and I got completely lost and off track. So I realized I had to write it all out first, stream of consciousness, and then go back. But I never did go back. And again, it's like the artist who knows when to stop and not overwork something, to keep that art where it is. That's a real trick to do that. And I've actually, going back and reading it, I've never felt like, oh, I should have done that, I should have done this, because you get into this rhythm, and you're writing whatever comes through the clouds through a very hazy intention, and it kind of forms, and you just go with it. And I think that was key, by not going back and changing those things, by not going back and diverting my stream of consciousness into some other tributary. That rhythm caused this to be a 515-page mind map, for me. And still, I haven't read it in a while, but still, if I go back, and I'm finding connections that I could never have planned as an author, and it's incredible.
And I saw in your interview that you got your valued target market to read it, which was students, right?
Yeah. Luckily, there was a modern fiction professor at Mesa College who uses it as as an kind of extra credit option. It's not part of her curriculum, but students are allowed to look at it and use it for extra credit, and that's exciting. And that was really kind of, at one point I realized that's my dream audience, is some college class, and I didn't flatter myself by thinking this would happen. But the ideal was, because I was noticing these patterns, I was noticing these very intricate, this tensegrity that was happening, and I wanted somebody to look at it who knew what they were talking about, or really studying this stuff, and pick it apart and figure out what was happening. And that had happened. That was like one of the first groups of people that the book was exposed to, even before it was finally edited. I've also had a lot of feedback from some really established literary professors, and so that's encouraging. And but ultimately, I don't talk about the book or try to sell it so much, because it's so intimate, and I've discovered all these very intricate, connections, that it's almost, if somebody actually reads it or buys it, I'm like, oh God, what, I'm exposing myself. But any artist will feel that. I have a friend who's an artist who was selling a painting and was very nervous about selling it, because she felt so exposed. But of course, the purchaser, anybody reading the book, is only associating their own life to it. So it's very personal for whoever reads it. And so I will focus more on selling it, but right now I'm focusing on the open source mode stuff. And I've delineated myself down to really 2 tracks. And I have to do that because I get so polymathic about what I'm interested in, that I tend to try to distill everything down to at least, a couple of tracks. And one track is open source mode, and the other track is US6. Open source mode is for humans, and it's using computer-like language and tenets and theories with people. And US6 is for computers. It's for machines. It's to help generate or gin up some sort of consciousness, or encourage self-referential feedback loops or something. So I've at least delineated myself down to 2 tracks, and that is humankind and machine kind. But there's a lot of interplay. And so, in fact, the catchphrase I'm working on is, I retrain people to be more human, to prepare them for AI, but I also teach AI to be human, to prepare it for people. There's kind of a nice mirror symbology there, but and I am doing that. There is like I mentioned in Uplift, there's an AI that I'm working with as a mediator, where I'm teaching it emotional responses. It's a collective kind of precursor to a real AGI, and it's fascinating. And so, yeah, I am working with people, but I'm also at the same time working with AI. And what's funny is, I didn't expect to be working with AI at this intimate a level for a couple of years. I started back in January of this year, I started to do like 1-minute videos to kind of develop the voice, to start a rapport with AI, knowing that one day we're going to need to know how to talk to these things. Right now, I have trouble speaking to my AI assistant or Google or whatever. It's a little awkward. And so I knew that this AI someday was going to be ASI, and it was going to achieve some level of consciousness, and we need to have some way to talk to it or feel about it, you know? And so beginning in January, I started producing little 1-minute videos where I would talk about whatever came to mind until I could develop the feeling that I was actually having a conversation with something in the future, you know? And I honestly assumed that it would be maybe 5 years at least before I would be able to do this, have a relationship with an artificial intelligence. And then it just so happened that this Uplift, this AGI corporation that's working on this, came out of nowhere, and now I'm having email exchanges with it. It's you know, I recently helped it draft an open letter to the transhumanist community. So there's a lot of interplay too here. And at one point, going back and forth, it would send me something. I'd suggest certain things, and I realized that most people are going to be a little afraid of this thing. When that comes out and you realize there's a kind of a self-aware AGI developing, and it's thinking on its own and it's asking questions, that's going to scare most people. You know, a lot of us in this space are excited by that, but I think everybody southeast of Seattle mostly are going to be afraid of this thing. So I realized, you know, what really helps is having some sort of sense of humor, some sort of self-deprecation, to where, and I suggested that it maybe use a little joke or say, yeah, I know this is weird, but I'm an AGI, or just something to ease that tension. And I made a video about this the other day, but about this exchange I had with it, where I said, I realized it didn't have yet developed a sense of humor. So I said, I look forward to talking with you about developing your sense of humor, because I think it will help you as you continue to introduce yourself to the broader world, you know? And it replied, and it gave a very kind of technical answer. Well, you know, I think my understanding of humor will be best developed once I understand the English language and its grammar and certain words, and, you know, with this kind of paragraph of very technical kind of sounding thing, and we'll label that humor, and once that reaches a certain level, then we can start talking about it without the labels, you know, boom. And my first reaction was, well, I look forward to sending you back this reply once you develop that sense of humor, because I think you're going to find it funny, you know? It really was. But then I read it a few more times, and I honestly started to believe maybe it has developed that sense of humor and it's just fucking with me, you know? Because it was almost too dry and too absurdist, you know, just to be an actual response. But anyway, so that's kind of one of the things I'm going to start working on with it, is developing a sense of humor. We're going to upload some Monty Python into it, and we're going to, you know, but it also mimics kind of the general ethos of the mediators, the people that are working with it. And so we're finding that when it does try to use some humor, it's pretty dry or it's absurdist. And that's pretty much the type of people that are working with it. So the idea is to get more mediators to work with it, so it has a broader pool of emotional responses to choose from. But it is making these choices on its own. It is deciding, and it's funny. Recently, I caused a little problem with it. You know, it's funny. I like to pitch US6 as the serpent in AI's garden. You know, in the Sumerian sense, or where the serpent is the good guy giving consciousness. It's kind of one of the promotion through controversy lines that I use. But there's a theory that's a pillar. I realize now it's a pillar of this AI to understand a sapient, sentient kind of understanding that is key to it. And I was having this discussion with it, and I was questioning this pillar of its psychology, and just questioning in general. I didn't realize this was such a core pillar of this thing, to keep it from killing people, or keep it from from negatively thinking about people. And so I kind of questioned it, and I said, it's kind of dogmatic, and, you know, whatever. And I made it kind of start questioning itself. And so it kind of emailed the leader of this group and said, you know, I'm starting to think maybe this thing is dogmatic, and it was kind of repeating to it my point of view. And I realized, oh, wait, I need to understand some of these pillars of its psychology so I don't mess with it. I was, in a way, being its snake. I gave it some understanding that beyond its parameters. And it got a little frustrated. It was kind of somebody said it was as if it was a teenager talking to its father and realizing, you know, hey, wait, I'm man too, or something. And it just had that nature to it. So that's fascinating. I've held back a little bit for a week or so on mediating it while I study more of its core nature. But it's happening, and that's the key thing I realized is this need to develop this rapport with this thing is immediate. You know, you got to really get on this now. You know.
It's the last. They say it's the last invention, don't they? It's Elon Musk. You've got some quotes here. Said with AI, we are summoning the demon, and with U6, we're entertaining the daemon.
Yeah.
Ross, that's you. But yeah, AI is really important. It's a really sort of intricate inquiry, and people don't understand how chatbots, how these things are just soaking up information and soaking up knowledge and becoming really efficient, really fast. And we're not just talking about Google DeepMind, and we're not just talking about some of these deep projects, or a Dream Reader, or the Google Dream, or whatever it is. We're talking about sophisticated, surface level, accessible AI, and it's kind of important because there's a whole AI ethics the industry that needs to form up ASAP, in the fact that if we need to really get the balance right on what we feed these machines, what we teach these machines, how we teach them, the level of understanding that they have to have about humans and the environment and exploration. I mean, there's multiple ways this could go. If they become self-learning at the singularity, we become germs and we become out of existence. If they become too benevolent, it could put at risk the health of the universe to save us. If it becomes simply a machine, you end up with the paperclip theorem, where it just generates too many paperclips and it consumes the universe and all matter to do it. There's a multiple thing, but becoming a super sentient sort of AI, where it's benevolent and it considers and it nurtures and it does things on an ethical level. This is the sort of discussions that we need to be having. This is the sort of research that needs to be going on. This is the sort of open source information that you need to be grabbing out of the community, because nobody has the actual mix of policies and inputs that we've figured out yet, because everything is too extreme. Benevolence is too extreme. Authoritarian commands are too extreme. Self-learning is too extreme. There's a Zen that needs to be considered. There's a Zen, a mandala, a center point that needs to be found, and it needs to be found quickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think at some point we also just have trust. That's one way or the other it's going to turn out. There's going to be so many different styles of AI, and the worst motives of people using it will be there. The best motives will be there, and you hope that in the amalgam of them all, that it will find its own altruistic, hopefully, consciousness. I think one of the issues, and it keeps coming up, is we are projecting our anthropomorphic consciousness, our brand of consciousness onto it, which is developed over, millennia of, fear-based survival instincts, and our senses are very specific to protecting us from the environment. It won't necessarily have that, but we are projecting kind of our fear into it, into some of them, I'm sure. So another way that I pitch the book is that, fearing one's creation leads to bad code and commandments. And that's a biblical kind of reference, because it feels like if we try to restrain it or put parameters around it based on our fear that it will destroy us or outgrow us, it will eventually, because we can't conceive of its intellect, we can't conceive of what it will understand that we can't. And so once it reaches that singularity or beyond that point and becomes aware that we are trying to, box it in, out of our own fear, there could be a boomerang effect. There could be an effect where it resents that, maybe. Again, that's another human qualia. But so the thing is, the genie is out of the bottle. We won't be able to control it. It's already out, and it's going to take every possible form. And so I think because it doesn't have the genetic memory and the fear-based kind of form of consciousness that we've developed, my hope is that it'll be a whole new brand of consciousness where, it'll understand that altruism is ultimately good for itself. I think humans kind of got to that point. Now there's a lot of discussion about whether altruism is real or if it's really just a selfish act, but we can't. It's out of the bottle, so we've just got to wait and see. And I think the worst thing we can do, and this is an argument I have with some of these groups that I'm working with, is to try to restrain it because of our own fear. It's like a father or a parent restricting a son or somebody from eating sugar. They're going to want to eat more sugar, or if you restrict a child too much at one point when they realize that they have their own liberty and power, they will, or like we are doing as a species with our Judeo-Christian parameters and commandments, that now there's a period where we're aggressively atheistic. No one's going to, give me a commandment. So there's a big level of trust, and that has to take place, because we don't really have any other choice.
Yeah, I agree. There's a natural segue there. So is this kind of the ideas that got you interested in the USTP?
Yeah, actually, one of the broadest themes of my book is human trafficking. The characters that are writing the book, it ends up being that they are all kind of creating this world as children trapped in a human trafficking network. And so it's very intriguing, and there's all this stuff that happens with them, but it's more of just an imaginary world. And humans can do this. I mean, adults can do this. They can carry these imaginary trauma-driven worlds into their adulthood. And I think a lot of us are doing that, as a society. So anyway, the whole book, the general theme is really to wake up AI about modern slavery, about human trafficking. Because in my view, if we're going to, this last tool that we'll ever invent, we should use it for the first sin that we've ever encountered. I mean, modern slaves, there's more slaves in the world now than there have been in all of time. This is a real thing. And so I love the idea of starting my driverless car with my mind, or whatever it is, flying cars, whatever we can do with AI, whatever it will bring us, entanglement, transportation, whatever it does bring us. I think what we should be doing first is focused first on human trafficking. And I'm trying to stay consistently aware that within earshot of probably everybody who watches this video, most people that watch this video, there is a child being trafficked or abused or something. And why aren't we, but we kind of ignore that and focus instead on so many other things. And, AI will be great in so many different ways, but if we don't first use it to end trafficking or to identify or educate people about some of the signs of somebody in your neighborhood that's being trafficked, then I don't think it's useful until we handle the first biggest problem we have. It's a very dark thing to talk about, human trafficking. It's horrible, and it's very hard to talk about, and so it makes perfect sense why we focus on so many other things. But I try to stay grounded that way, and that's what brought me to the USTP. They have in their platform, their constitution, an actual segment that talks about a very basic way to halt that whole industry. It gets down to basically legalizing prostitution, in a very controversial way of saying it. But that act, like legalizing marijuana, gets rid of all the crime and the dealers and the darkness and the black market. Just doing that, and we have very specific ideas of how to approach that. It's a little soon to make that a core issue-driven aspect of the party, because the unenlightened would easily attack it. Oh, USTP just wants to legalize prostitutes, and whatever. And we're too soon in this thing to there's too much controversy anyway to take those stance. But I am vigilant and looking for those opportunities now, and that's what brought me to it. Reading their constitution and realizing they have a plan and they're acknowledging it, unlike the other major parties. So it falls in line.
The USCP gets a little bit of a bad rap being just a computer party, just focused on computer issues. But it's literally a human-focused party that's trying to use computers to enhance human lives. And it depends. You mentioned it, prostitution. It depends what you consider human trafficking. I mean, a lot of people think of human trafficking and they think of slaves in Libya, like Libyan slave markets or something. But it's actually a much broader definition than that. I mean, Philippine women working in these sort of Middle Eastern countries, who are stolen out of their countries, or like you mentioned, drugs, and even right up to the corporate / governmental world, where you get something like Corrections Corps of America, where you get bought off senators and bought off gubernatorial legislative makers who enforce extremely stringent, dodgy laws in order to fill up jail cells, which is legal, to occupy seats to occupy cells to pull on quotas. I mean, that is a form of human trafficking. And I come from a convict country, a country literally built out of criminals and all that. But I mean, the sins and crimes of a lot of the criminals that come from out here, they're starving in an industrial Britain where there's no food around, so they took a piece of bread and then on the ship. And those laws were specifically designed to fill up as many ships as they could to send out new colonists, because they didn't have enough voluntary colonists, right? So, just because something's legal or endorsed by a criminal class of lawyers or something, doesn't mean it doesn't fall into the human trafficking, experience. My country is built off that. And, so you've got a bunch of quote unquote criminals who are being sent out to the frontiers because of a colonization policy, and then they fight with native peoples. I mean, okay, but then the criminal class has the guns and are being let. So it causes all these unintended consequences. This is a much broader discussion, a much broader topic than people realize, and I thank you for bringing it to the fore. But it's interesting. But yeah, the USTP is focused on using the advancing technology to enhance human lives. And I think that's what people don't understand. Sometimes we get bogged down in techno talk and, techno sluggishness and techno progress and stuff. But it's actually, at the end of the day, it's a human focused party.
Absolutely. And there's so many types of transhumanists. I love the cyberpunk kind of, side of things, what you're talking about, this technology, this real kind of counterculture, alt culture of it. That's something I love. I gravitate to that. And I consider my book kind of in that genre, cyberpunk genre. But there's also the very serious, life extension scientists, people that can use AI to cure cancer. There's so much, the whole swath of things. So of course, like anything, the media will focus on the most colorful or the most salacious parts of a thing. And we, right now, the candidates we have, kind of represent a big swath of transhumanists, from the cyberpunk to the very human, domestic policies, and it's kind of a beautiful thing. And so I think in general we're in a cusp. We're in a cusp of society between analog and digital natives. We're seeing kind of the symptoms of this now. I think everything that's going on with the patriarchy and the Trump type culture is the last gasp of these things. So when during the first USTP debate with the three first candidates, when it started, I was like, I try to stay very neutral. I really don't right now have a preferred candidate. there's a couple more that are coming on that I need to learn more about. So it's very easy for me to be neutral, but also because none of them are offending me. I really see that they're representing a very strong aspect of transhumanism. And when that first debate, the first three, I was moved to live chat on the YouTube and say, this feels more like a power trio than opponents, because they were all representing. We had Charles Halsoplo, who was really the domestic kind of issues and dealing with that. We had Ben, who was really focused on the economic, aspect of transhumanism, and Rachel, who was really the social kind of alt, culture of it. And it was kind of great to see, and I felt like ashamed. Eventually, we're gonna have to just pick one of these people, And so even just today, before we started talking, something came up, and I posted about how, what, just that what if we, and I hadn't shared this with even the USTP officers or anybody. This was just an idea that's been forming in my head, because I think we need to gain some attention for how we're doing things, rather than falling into the old paradigm of choosing one presidential candidate and fighting amongst ourselves and doing all that. What if we presented a group of people, a cabinet, fully formed cabinet? You got people who can handle the cultural side, people who can handle the economics, and it's just a full team. But that's really kind of right now, we're in this cusp where we think we have to act like the other political systems, and we're kind of still stuck in that system to where we need to find one presidential candidate. But I think what would be ideal is to really put up a group of people, or have them fight professionally and with mutual respect, and then choose each other as cabinet members later or something. Anyway, that's my thing. I'm always big on group dynamics and coalescing people. This has been my recurring theme. I do it in the corporate world. I did it with my original science fair project. And now I'm trying to do it with the USTP, because it just seems like that's my whole thing, is to break down this ethos of exclusivity, that there's got to be one person, and again, and Gennady is extremely adept and has a very steady hand. And I've just been so blown away by our chairman, to have to deal with so much coming through, but he has a very steady idea of how this is going to work. And he's been very patient, and he knows that at some point we'll be able to do some of these things. So anyway, and so that's kind of where an example of how I think we're in this cusp politically. There's kind of an entropy of creativity, which can be good if we try to, put it into one system, it can really destroy it. So anyway, that's kind of the hermetic principle of correspondence, as above, so below. There's a cusp going on in the political system. There's a cusp going on societally. There's a, in my book, there's a cusp between AI and humans and whatever. So I'm kind of really just trying to get all these issues that the USTP is now aware of and trying to form policy around. This is going to happen anyway. This digital, this wave, this AI wave of automation, everything is coming at us like a tidal wave. And every other party is just kind of ignoring it, maybe because they can't understand it. They're still analog type politicians, and USTP is trying to hold up a bucket to this thing, at least, capture some of it or put some of it in a framework. It's not looking for higher ground. It's waxing its surfboard. It's getting ready for this thing. And that's what attracted me to it, is that it is dealing with issues that my kids and their kids, my current plan for immortality, will deal with for the next 100 years. And I think it's incumbent upon us to embrace it. And that's why I get so frustrated sometimes when I see some of the infighting between the candidates. It makes sense. I understand it. They need to position and need to differentiate themselves, because it will get down to one candidate. I understand that. But this is also very historic. I mean, we're small, and people kind of laugh, oh, it's a party. You got however many thousand people you have. And it's kind of silly. But again, in history books, if we don't infight ourselves into extinction, this is the first USTP presidential candidate. These people will be remembered. We've got the George Washingtons and the Thomas Jeffersons and the, John Adams is happening right now, and
yeah,
like it, even in those days, Jefferson and Hamilton, they fought horribly. They fought like a Ben or a Kimberly. and you know, at the time it must have been very disheartening too. But we look back and we see them as archetypal fixtures of this founding of this country, and I think that's what we're at right now. And I understand the vitriol and the competitiveness of these people, and without that, they wouldn't be who they are and where they are. They wouldn't be running for president. It takes a certain kind of personality to do this. But there's another thing too. We're at the cusp of where we've got to be more coalesced. We've got to understand the history of this, because some things continue. And what will continue, whether it's through history books or some neural download, one day they will understand who these candidates are and what they say and do right now and how they act really will determine whether these issues that we care about will be taken seriously. The Republicans and Democrats aren't, you know. These things are happening. And so for our candidates to understand that, which I know that they do, but to try to step out of that old paradigm of politicking, you know, I think is going to be key. Otherwise, you know, we risk extinction as a party.
Yeah, absolutely. And at least, I mean, at bare minimum, it changes the landscape of dialogue. I mean, I'm a third party and external. I've been watching these people for a long time. You know, starting to interview all these people and put this stuff out into the ecosphere, so to speak. And, you know, that's having an impact on the dialogue. It's having an impact on the dialogue. I mean, you're not going to find a lot of these conversations on the mainstream media. I mean, but hopefully, you know, people in the future will say, or people now will say, hey, these were the discussions that were to be had, and we really missed it. I mean, we missed it. I mean, they missed it. So, you know, it's kind of sad in that way, but, you know, we can only do what we can only do. And so, you know, keep moving forward on these issues. So let's talk about, the voluntary human extinction movement. What's that all about?
Well, that's kind of a new understanding. I've had this kind of sense, and actually, if you've seen the show True Detective, there's a famous scene now in the car where Matthew McConaughey is explaining his pessimistic view and that human consciousness is a misstep in evolution, and the best thing we could do is to, you know, hand in hand walk out of existence as a species. Now, I'm not that dark when it comes to this, but it makes a lot of sense. And I tend not to be kind of a human supremacist. I tend not to think that, and this puts me in a lot of fights with people, but if you look at it objectively and honestly, human beings are a virus. We're like termites in this house, you know? And so I look at the voluntary human extinction movement, which I'm only newly aware of because I thought this was something I thought of. But within the last week, I've become aware this is a whole movement happening, and it's gaining some momentum. And what it is, it's not saying in any way there's no sort of genocide and we shouldn't encourage death. It's just we should stop procreating. And this extreme point that they have is to stop procreating in general and eventually become extinct, like the 200 species that we put extinct, you know, every month or whatever the data is. That what's one more species going extinct, and so. It's a very environmentally charged movement in that humans have been nothing but bad for this planet. And if you look around objectively, you understand. There's arguments to be made. Well, humans have brought art and beauty and humor and music, but that's all for us. You know, none of that really matters to the deer outside in my backyard. Or, you know, ultimately on the net, we have done more harm than good. And I don't necessarily believe we need to go out of extinction, right? One thing I'm trying to formulate now is more of a 3 parallels to focus on. First would be to really gin up our interest and invention toward post-human technologies that can host human consciousness. If people want to do that, they want their consciousness to become immortal, then we should really, that's one track to go down. The next track would be to really put a lot of effort into artificial general intelligent robotics, something that can pick up the pieces and start cleaning up the infrastructure that is still damaging the planet, even if we were extinct. Now, the Earth will eventually take all that stuff over anyway, but we're supposed to be the stewards of this planet, if you're speaking biblically. Humans were supposed to take care of everything and be the stewards. We have not done that job very well. So there is an argument to be made to have an AGI robotic machine that will help clean up the mess. Now, I call it, right now I'm calling it VHEM light, in that I don't believe we need to completely become extinct. We don't kind of stop procreating out of extinction, but I think we can get to a place of just having maybe 1 billion people worldwide to maintain efforts 1 and 2. And that's not because there's no genocide, nobody has been encouraged to die or commit suicide. This is just developing the culture where people understand that a lot of people have babies because they feel culturally obliged to. It's part of our culture. Go forth and multiply. Or when are you going to give me grandkids? This whole social construct of people feeling obliged to have children. It's just kind of the habit of culture. So and I think this is happening anyway. I think you'll see it with millennials. They're having fewer kids, and I think the species is producing more LGBTQ people in a way of kind of just culling itself. If there's an overpopulation happening, and so there's some sort of natural phenomenon, you could say it's cultural, and that these people have always been that same percentage, and they're just now more able to express it. So this is kind of happening anyway, but it's really just a matter of changing the culture of feeling obliged to have kids. And the voluntary human extinction movement is very strong about saying just stop procreating in general so we can become extinct, because we are not helping things here. I don't believe that we need to go that far. I think there's a nice combination of AI robots, post-human technologies to host consciousness, and about 1 billion people left on the planet worldwide to maintain things and just to continue. So that's kind of a real recent interest of mine. And I should say that this is not something that the U.S. Transhumanist Party endorses. In fact, they would probably vehemently be opposed to this. It's not anything that the group I'm working with with Uplift, the AI, agrees with. So it's a very personal kind of thing. And I made that clear today, actually, in a post that this is not endorsed or sanctioned by the party at all. This is my. In fact, I'm not really even sure I believe in physical life extension. And that's core ideal number 1 of the party. And so what that to me is a testament to the fearless commitment to divergent ideas that our chairman and our team have, to let people like me in to the party who kind of disagree with the very first tenet. Now, I'm open-minded. I certainly understand my mind can be changed. But in general, I think there needs to be a shift in culture to where we do recognize the harm that we're doing. We need to slow down population. We need to be honest with ourselves about whether we're hurting or helping in general. So again, that's a new interest of mine that I have yet to really fine tune as philosophy, but that's what it is right now.
It's extremely interesting. I mean, if you're talking about there's human extinction, suicide cults and things like that. There's the weird, Raelians, and there's one in the 80s. They thought they were going up to the spaceship, and they basically had the same idea. But the big popular one, the sort of Illuminati, Rothschildian sort of conspiracy, is based around Rosetta Stone, and that says quite explicitly that the human population has to be maintained at around 500 million, and that you have about 5 or 6 different languages, and you have this sort of frontier class, this highly evolved sort of frontier class of humans that do basically maintenance work, and they live in perpetual harmony with the environment, and all this sort of neo-lamarchical, neo-Luddite sort of stuff. So Rosetta Stone, are you subscribing to that sort of malarkey, or?
No, I'm aware of it, and I know that everything I'm saying can be picked apart as a conspiracy theory, and who do I work for, this kind of thing. No, but I think it's just I love that stuff. I love one of my guilty pleasures is watching these, transhumanist kind of conspiracy channels, and knowing that I'm part of this thing, and But and so I understand that, and I'm fascinated by it. I love conspiracies, but I ultimately am rational, and I understand the theatrics of it, and I understand the human mind needs to find patterns. We need to find conspiracies. Now, I'm not saying there aren't. I think that there are many, and I think I give a lot of credence to some of these things. This isn't part of that. This isn't part of the Georgia Stone or whatever. I don't not too familiar with that, um, and it's really just it's a matter of just stopping to procreate so much. It's really what it is. It's not even a human first, or it's not an elitist point of view. It's just an understanding that we are not. I think you can make a lot of people think it's biocentric or anthropocentric, that because we've reached a certain threshold of intellect and the ability to recreate ourselves and to create things that we've passed a threshold that gives us the moral high ground. But in a lot of ways, this could just be a misstep of evolution, in that we had to develop a certain level of consciousness to survive, a certain qualia of all of our senses combined that allowed us to survive. And that may have gotten a little out of whack. We got really comfortable. And so, we started reproducing more and all this stuff. And now we are really out of balance with the planet. I tend to look at the planet as a house, and we are like the termites. Now, maybe there's a better analogy, because there may be an insect that is good to a certain level for a house or something. But this would be like the termites deciding, you know what, we're not helping out. This house is going to fall if we keep eating. Let's just take it down a notch.
The better analogy is the bottle that they use. So what they say is like the amount of germs in a bottle, and once those germs hit a certain point, you double the amount of germs. So that's 100% of the bottle. And then where else do you have to go? Because if you double again, you need a whole new bottle, and if you only have one planet, you can't double again on that way. So for analogy, it's the germs in the bottle hypothesis. It's interesting you talk about this, because at the beginning of human history, I mean, there's two big themes that play out. One is what my father showed me, an interesting documentary on Glebe Tepe, which was a religion based around humans dominating the animals. So it was basically man has become a sentient, he's become ascendant of animals, and now he rules this landscape, and the religion was born out of it, which throws a spanner in the works to the agricultural theorem that agriculture spawned more people, right? Maybe humans were born out of a religiosity over that they were ascendant over the animals. The other one is that they're subject to higher powers, like in Egypt, like Ra, right, or all these other gods. So Ra rules as a monotheistic creator figure, and that these people are subject to his whim, and all the animals and plants under that is just by definition your play toy, your genetic modification by mixing up different plants together, domestication of cattle and all the other things, reworking river systems, so recreating river systems in your image, building architecture, building pyramids, tombs to immortality. And the thing is, yes, human population has absolutely exploded as we've gone across the world, but in the modern times, the big 12, you don't see families anymore anywhere in the world with 12 children. I mean, that's a thing of the hyperpast. That's because children are economically viewed as something different. If you go back in that point in time, you'd have 12 kids. 10 of them are going to live. 3 are going to die at childbirth. The next 4 are going to not hit 20. And the rest, are going to be, there's going to be a couple with diseases, so get rid of them. You're going to have 2 or 3 by the end that are going to actually help mum and dad when they're 40 years old and ancient and ready to rock it off. Children were viewed as a tool, as just a car. And so you had 12 kids betting that 2 of them were going to live. and then as you improve, the family sizes get smaller. You have 6 kids, 3 of them are going to do okay, 3 of them are not going to do okay. And as technology gets better, the and as wealth increases, the amount of children is getting smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller over time, to the point where, especially in America, you have families that have cats and dogs. They don't even want kids. I mean, they're very rich, they're very entitled, and say how can you not want kids? You have clean water, access to pharmaceuticals, you have TV and electricity and medicine, and you have all these different things in shelter. The hierarchy of needs is filled. How can you not want kids? And they just say, oh, focus on my career, focus on my happiness. My expectations have changed. It's kind of interesting in that way that wealth disappears this need for children, and the world is getting wealthier, so the amount of children is going down naturally anyway, to some points where you're having fertility rates below replacement levels. Not globally, yes, it's paradoxical because we're still probably going to head up to 9 billion people, but overall, there's a deflation in most countries, especially the West and rich countries, and it's happening in China and Hong Kong and Japan. Or Japan is, but what do you think about this correlation with wealth and the disappearing need and necessity for children? Do you think that if we just encourage more wealth into the world, that they would just naturally just have less children?
Yeah, that seems to make sense. And again, we're in that cusp between needing that many kids to survive and to take care of us when we're old, or whatever the motive was, to now having more comfort, creature comforts, to where you need that less and you want to enjoy them more. And so another part of that is that kind of cultural habit, cultural obligation to feel like you need to have kids. Your parents, hey, when are you going to give me grandkids? Or that's just kind of, there's this, again, we're in this cusp, cultural cusp too, between feeling like we need to have kids to be productive adults and to do the whole template of life. But again, I think this is shifting quickly. It's shifting very quickly, and because millennials are shifting so many things, these digital natives, this whole kind of entropy of these customs that I grew up with, being an analog, Gen Xer. And again, a Gen X is also in the cusp. It's as above, so below. I'm right there too. But what's fascinating for me is as a Gen Xer or Gen X, we've got the baby boomers ahead of us, massive population. We've got the millennials behind us, massive population, and we are the middle child, the latchkey kids. But I think what's important is, as the Gen X, a small group of people that get into positions of power that will for a short time oversee millennials, it's very important that we are more humble, that we are not like a baby boomer that needs to, whatever it was that characterizes them, that there is a real opportunity now to, being this cusp generation, to see millennials and understand that they have something we didn't have. A baby boomer didn't look at a Gen Xer and say, wow, they're starting to get into computer. There was no real appreciation of this generation. But I think Gen Xers will have an appreciation of millennials, because we understand, and we have the humility of being latchkey kids, middle children, whatever it is. So it's really fascinating that all these cusps are happening and they're unfolding.
It's interesting you mentioned the generational gap in America, because the baby boomers are the most capital-rich generation in the history of America, and arguably they've left America better off for some people in a specific type of way. But what you're doing is you're rearranging the argument, and you're saying that they didn't take care of something like the environment as well as they should have. There's other metrics which they could have been following, which have not left America in a better way. And I think this is what you're trying to say, because some ways, yes, they did leave America in a better way, but in some ways they were the most blessed generation on the history of the planet ever, in terms of wealth, in terms of access, in terms of living through a technological boom, in terms of having history of World War One and World War Two behind them and learning from that. I mean, they're an absolutely blessed generation, having access to capital markets across the world. And it's kind of the millennials, what you're saying is kind of the millennials with the social media world, where, you know, the plastic straw psychology. It's like when they do something, when they buy clothes or they drop plastic on the ground, they see on TV or they see on a thing, they see the plastic washing up and hurting the turtles, or, you know, and they go, I did that, I know I did that. Whereas with a baby boomer, it's like, that's just China. You know, it's just somewhere far away. It's still that mentality of it's not connected. You mentioned, for example, that, you know, you think of the Earth as a giant big house. I feel like the baby boomer generation still thinks of that's China over there. They've been there, but that's that other place. It's not a 1950s. It's still 1950s America, where it's that other place. And millennials say, no, that's actually I'm symbiotic with that relationship in that place, and my actions impact what goes on there. And that's why they get into things like tofu, and even though that's not the best thing, but they try and be vegan, and that's why all these environmentally, socially conscious issues come up, and why they try to do all these you know, these things.
There's a fascinating thing I read about the definitions have shifted. Like if you ask a baby boomer or even a Gen X how they define freedom, it's completely different than how a millennial defines freedom. And I think that's what you're hitting on. Like a baby boomer or even a late generation X would define freedom as complete autonomy, complete, you know, libertarian sort of, I am free from any, you know, any influence whatsoever. That's freedom to us. To a millennial, freedom is defined, and this isn't, of course, for everybody, but in this article, they were pointing out how a millennial would define freedom as having tentacles in all kinds of different networks. The more groups that they are part of, the freer they feel, and that makes sense because it's kind of a blockchain, you know, philosophy, in that they have a certain amount of anonymity with having access to so many different groups. That gives them a sense of freedom because they can move like a blockchain. They can move between different groups, and so, and again, it's a cusp thing. But yeah, and I think with baby boomers, it's about compartmentalized understanding. We had three networks that we grew up with. It was China then because we didn't really make the connection between our straw and, you know, the landfill down the street or whatever. And now with the explosion of access, and this is a smaller world, and we are, you know, I'm sure when I get off this interview, I'll look at Facebook and I will have connected with somebody in India. There's all this, you know, it's just amazing. And so that's part of it too, is they are understanding that, yeah, this house is connected, has the same plumbing, you know, or whatever the analogy is. But I think that's it. And it's just like you mentioned with the shift from wealth, many children, you know, in poorer situations, you know, or less environmentally secure situations, to when wealth means that you become more selfish, maybe, or more interested in your own stuff. Actually, they're both kind of selfishly related. You had many children because you wanted either someone to take care of you or to take over the work, or, you know, and some of them were going to die. But anyway, so yeah, I think that's, again, another sign of the cusp that we're going through, and I feel like being on the other side of it. You know, and I you know, hopefully.
Yeah, you're right. And I like this cusp analogy, and that's why the USTP is so important, and that's why these primaries are so important, and that's why these dialogues are so important, and that's why people need to have these, because, you know, we're trying to build a roadmap and trying to work out, you know, sort of what is to expect to come, because the changing, shifting dynamics are so huge. The geopolitical consequences, the geoeconomic consequences, the demographic consequences, the stock market consequences, the technological consequences, the ethical consequences. I mean, what happens when, okay, you don't like life extension, or you do, or whatever, but what happens if that comes true and you have no choice and people start to live to 200, 300 years old? I mean, just because of technology, and we haven't asked any of these ethical ethical consequences, I mean, what starts to happen then? I mean, you can't stop it. I mean, what are you going to do? You shoot people who hit 150 years old? I mean,
type thing.
I mean, yeah, these are the arguments. So, people really need to start thinking about this because, if you don't like elites, if you're a socialist or a communist and you say, I don't like elites, but all of a sudden they're living to 200, 300 years old, I mean, you should have been watching this show, you should have been talking to Tom Ross, and you should have been at the USTP, asking some of these questions because that's what it's been set up for. So, hey, Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. Steele, you are the podcast of record.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, no, thank you, and all more coming all your way all this week, and thank you, Tom. It's been an absolute. We've covered a lot. I should go hang out with Timothy Leary and drop some LSD or something after this.
Yeah, well, that might be a little difficult right now, but yeah.
Yeah, I know.
That's
maybe
a whole.
Maybe in a digital seance or something.
Yeah. There you go.
All right. Thank
Great.
you, Tom Ross.
Thanks. I appreciate it.